Angola was not unfamiliar to Detective Elric Graves, but the situation he found himself thrust into now was beyond the ordinary. The coastal winds whispered stories of dread, and the humid air carried the scent of fear. The small village of Luando had become a charnel house, the site of 30 grisly murders, all linked by a single grotesque commonality: the bodies of the victims had been mangled almost beyond recognition. Elric first heard of the case in Lisbon, where whispers of the supernatural clung to the news like smoke. Locals spoke of a demon horse stalking the savannah, its venomous breath said to rot the crops, and its skeletal rider sowing madness. To those who knew the lore, one name arose like a shadowy spectre: the Nuckelavee. But how could a creature of Arcadian mythology manifest thousands of miles away in the heart of Africa? The drive from the provincial capital to Luando was long and unforgiving. Endless plains stretched toward the horizon, dotted with the bones of cattle and the burned husks of trees. The people he passed on the road averted their gaze, murmuring prayers under their breath. By the time Elric reached the village, the air felt electric, the oppressive weight of death bearing down on his chest. Chief Amaro, a wiry man with sunken cheeks and haunted eyes, greeted him at the edge of the village. "Detective Graves," he began, wringing his hands as though trying to expel some inner demon, "I hope you know what you're doing. This isn't a normal case." "Most aren't," Elric replied, his voice a flat growl that betrayed neither fear nor confidence. "But you wouldn't have called me if it were." Amaro led Elric through the narrow dirt paths, past rows of crumbling huts adorned with protective charms made of feathers, bones, and twigs. The villagers watched from the shadows, their faces etched with despair. When they reached the site of the first massacre, Elric felt a sharp pang in his gut. The scene was nightmarish: bodies torn apart with surgical precision, their flesh stripped to reveal glistening bone. Blood soaked the earth, its metallic tang mingling with the stench of decay. Flies buzzed in a frenzied cloud above the corpses, and the ground beneath them was scorched, as if seared by an unnatural heat. What kind of weapon could do this? Elric asked, though he already suspected the answer. Amaro shook his head. "Not a weapon. Witnesses say it was a beast, a monster." Elric knelt beside one of the corpses, examining the wounds. The cuts were jagged yet oddly precise, as though made by talons or teeth. But what struck him most were the hoof prints embedded deep in the soil, each as large as a manhole cover. "There's more," Amaro whispered, his voice trembling. "The survivors, they say it speaks." Elric found the survivors gathered in the village's meager church, a weathered structure barely held together by mud bricks and faith. Inside, the air was stifling, the dim light from the candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. The first to speak was Mavuto, a young herdsman whose arm had been mangled in the attack. His voice wavered as he recounted the horror. "It came with the storm. A beast, half horse, half man. Its skin was gone, just muscle and bone. And its eyes, they burned." Another survivor, an elderly woman named Joanna, clutched a rosary as she spoke. "It called to us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In a language I didn't understand. But its meaning was clear. It promised death, suffering, hunger." Elric pressed her for details, but Joanna fell silent, her eyes glazed with terror. The others weren't much help either. Their stories, though vivid, were fragmented, riddled with inconsistencies and half-remembered details. Still, one thread tied them all together: the Nuckelavee had come for them, and it wouldn't stop until its hunger was sated. Elric left the church with more questions than answers. The legends he knew painted the Nuckelavee as a harbinger of plague and famine, its presence a punishment for human arrogance. But why here? Why now? And why such carnage? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the savannah in hues of crimson and gold, Elric felt the first pangs of unease. The night ahead would not be kind. Night fell like a heavy curtain over Luando, plunging the village into an oppressive silence. Detective Elric Graves sat alone in the small hut that Chief Amaro had provided him, pouring over his notes by the light of an oil lamp. The rhythmic chirping of crickets outside did little to soothe his nerves. If anything, it felt like the prelude to something unspeakable. The survivors' descriptions haunted him. A beast stripped of its skin, its grotesque fusion of horse and man, and the way it spoke. Elric had seen his share of the supernatural, but the Nuckelavee belonged to an entirely different kind of nightmare. The only sound within the hut was the scratch of his pen and the occasional hiss from the oil lamp. That is, until the silence was broken by a low, guttural noise. At first, Elric thought it was the wind, but the sound carried a deliberate cadence, like the exhalation of a massive beast. He froze, every instinct in his body screaming that something was outside. Rising from his chair, he moved to the window. The savannah stretched out before him, bathed in the pale light of the moon. At first, he saw nothing, just the sway of the tall grass in the wind. But then he noticed it, a shadow too large to belong to any natural creature, slinking through the grass on the edge of the village. Elric grabbed his revolver, loaded with custom silver bullets, and crept out of the hut. The night air was thick with tension, each step he took crunching softly on the dry ground. The villagers' homes were dark, no one dared venture outside after sunset. As he reached the outskirts of the village, the grass seemed to part of its own accord, revealing the massive figure. For a moment, Elric couldn't breathe. The creature was as the survivors had described, a grotesque amalgamation of horse and rider, its fleshless body glistening with sinew and blood. The rider's torso grew directly out of the horse's neck, its arms long and skeletal, ending in clawed hands that twitched in the moonlight. Its head was too large, its empty sockets filled with a faint, smoldering light. Elric raised his gun, but the creature didn't charge. Instead, it stood still, its hollow gaze fixed on him. Then, in a voice that seemed to reverberate within his skull, it spoke. "You cannot stop me, mortal. I am hunger. I am plague. You are but a fleeting breath in the eternal rot." Elric squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the night, and the creature let out an unholy scream as the silver bullet tore through its shoulder. But when the smoke cleared, it was gone, the grass swaying as though it had never been there. The villagers found him at dawn, standing at the edge of the grasslands with his revolver still drawn. Chief Amaro approached cautiously, his expression a mix of fear and concern. "You saw it, didn't you?" the chief asked, though he already knew the answer. Elric nodded, lowering his weapon. "It's real. And it's intelligent." Amaro shuddered. "Then we're all doomed." "No," Elric said firmly. "Not yet." He spent the morning inspecting the spot where the creature had stood. The ground was scorched, the grass blackened and brittle. A foul stench lingered in the air, a sickly combination of sulfur and decay. But most intriguing were the tracks, a mixture of hoofprints and human-like impressions, as though the creature's rider had dismounted and walked alongside it. Following the trail, Elric found something unexpected, a large, circular mark etched into the earth, surrounded by smaller symbols. Kneeling down, he recognized them immediately, protective wards, similar to the ones he had encountered in other cases. But these had been defiled, the symbols marred with deep, deliberate scratches. "Someone summoned it," Elric murmured, his voice laced with grim certainty. The question was, who? Chief Amaro led Elric to the outskirts of the village, where a solitary hut stood surrounded by rows of dried herbs and animal bones. Inside lived Baba Namuri, the village's oldest and most reclusive inhabitant. Rumors abounded about her, some called her a healer, others a witch, but all agreed she was the one person who might know how to deal with the Nuckelavee. The old woman greeted them with a cackle that sent chills down Elric's spine. Her eyes were milky with cataracts, but she moved with an unnatural grace, her bony fingers gesturing for them to sit. "You've brought trouble with you," she said, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "The Nuckelavee was not born here. It was brought. Called from across the ocean by fools who do not understand its hunger." "Who called it?" Elric asked, leaning forward. Baba Namuri shook her head. I do not know. But I can tell you this, it will not leave until it is fed. 30 souls may not be enough to sate its hunger. And if it grows stronger, it will become unstoppable. What do I need to do? The old woman fixed him with a penetrating gaze. To banish the Nuckelavee, you must find the one who summoned it. Only their blood will break the curse. As Elric left the hut, a sense of foreboding settled over him. The path ahead was clear, but the cost of victory would be steep. As the sun began to sink behind the savannah, Detective Elric Graves convened with Chief Amaro and the village elders in the small, crumbling church. The villagers were restless, their collective fear palpable in the humid air. Elric scanned the room, his gaze lingering on each face. Someone here knew more than they were letting on. Baba Namuri believes this creature was summoned intentionally, Elric said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. If that's true, one of you knows how it got here. Speak now, or more blood will spill. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. An uneasy silence stretched, broken only by the faint rustle of wind outside. Finally, an older man named Joachim stood. His hands trembled as he pointed toward a younger man sitting in the corner. It's him, Joachim hissed. Matthias. He's been meddling with things he shouldn't. All eyes turned to Matthias, a wiry fisherman with a sharp, furtive gaze. He shot to his feet, his face contorted with anger. That's a lie, he shouted. You blame me because I don't pray to your God. Because I don't follow your superstitions. Enough, Elric barked, silencing the room. He stepped toward Matthias, his boots echoing on the stone floor. If you've done nothing wrong, then you have nothing to fear. But if you're hiding something, now is the time to tell me. Matthias clenched his fists, his jaw tight. For a moment, it seemed he might lash out. But then his shoulders sagged, and he sank back into his chair. I don't know anything about summoning demons, he muttered. But I've seen something. Something strange. Elric's eyes narrowed. Go on. Matthias hesitated, then began to speak. 3 weeks ago, before the killing started, I was fishing near the river at night. I saw a group of men in the distance, near the old baobab tree. They were chanting, holding torches. I didn't stay to see more, I was afraid. Who were they? Elric pressed. I don't know, Matthias admitted. I didn't recognize them. But they weren't from this village. Elric turned to Chief Amaro. What's near this baobab tree? Amaro's face darkened. An abandoned mission. The missionaries fled decades ago, after unpleasantness. No one goes there anymore. We'll see about that, Elric said, his tone grim. The next morning, Elric set out for the old mission, accompanied by Chief Amaro and 2 reluctant villagers armed with machetes. The journey was grueling, the heat oppressive as they trekked through the tall grass and scrub. The baobab tree loomed in the distance, its gnarled branches stretching skyward like skeletal fingers. When they reached the mission, it was clear no one had tended the place in years. The stone walls were cracked and overgrown with vines, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. But as they stepped through the broken gates, Elric noticed something unsettling, fresh footprints in the dirt. Someone's been here recently, he said, drawing his revolver. They moved cautiously through the crumbling structure, the shadows seeming to shift around them. In the chapel, they found the remnants of a ritual, a charred circle on the floor, surrounded by symbols scrawled in ash. Animal bones and feathers littered the ground, along with a rusted knife caked in dried blood. Elric knelt to examine the markings, his brow furrowed. These aren't just random symbols, he muttered. They're binding sigils. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were summoning. Chief Amaro's face was pale. Why here? Why would they use this place? Because it's tainted ground, Elric replied. The violence here left a stain. It makes the veil between worlds thinner, easier to pierce. As he spoke, a low, guttural growl echoed through the chapel. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the shadows. Slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a large, muscular dog with glowing red eyes and a mouth filled with jagged teeth. "Run," Elric ordered, raising his revolver. The others bolted as the beast charged. Elric fired, the silver bullet striking the creature in the chest. It howled in pain, but it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged again, its claws raking across his arm. Elric gritted his teeth, firing twice more. The beast staggered, then collapsed into a heap of ash. He stumbled back, clutching his bleeding arm. This wasn't just a summoning gone wrong. This was deliberate. Back in the village, Elric stitched his wound with shaking hands as Chief Amaro looked on. "What was that thing?" the chief asked, his voice trembling. "A guardian," Elric replied. "Whoever summoned the Nuckelavee left that thing behind to keep people away. They didn't want anyone finding out what they'd done." "And did you find anything useful?" Elric hesitated, then pulled a small leather-bound book from his coat. "This was in the chapel," he said. "It's a journal. If we're lucky, it'll tell us who's behind this." As he flipped through the pages, his expression darkened. The entries were written in a mix of Portuguese and a language Elric didn't recognize, but one name kept appearing: Father Vicente. "Who is Father Vicente?" he asked. Amaro's face went pale. "He was the last missionary here. They say he went mad before the mission closed. That he experimented with forbidden rituals." Elric nodded grimly. "Then it's time we paid Father Vicente a visit, wherever he is now." If Vicente had survived his descent into madness, Elric suspected he hadn't strayed far from his old domain. The Nuckelavee wasn't just a weapon. It was part of something larger, something more sinister than even he could fully grasp. And the clock was ticking. Night fell over the village once more, and the atmosphere grew heavier with dread. Elric Graves sat by a small fire outside his hut, poring over Father Vicente's journal. The priest's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, his words spiraling into incoherence. But amidst the fevered ramblings, one phrase stood out. "To call the rider is to beckon the storm." The accompanying pages detailed rituals unlike any Elric had ever encountered. Vicente had combined Christian liturgy with arcane symbols and chants borrowed from pre-colonial Angolan traditions. It was clear the priest had been experimenting with forces he barely understood. Elric traced his finger along the scrawled diagrams. A recurring pattern, a circle within a triangle surrounded by jagged lines, seemed to function as both a summoning and a control mechanism. But something about the design was flawed, incomplete. Chief Amaro approached quietly, his face illuminated by the firelight. "Did you find anything?" "Vicente was the one who summoned the Nuckelavee," Elric replied, closing the journal. "But I don't think he meant to. His ritual was unstable, and now it's out of control." Amaro frowned. "If Vicente is dead, how do we stop it?" "We find the circle," Elric said. "If Vicente's ritual failed, it means the summoning wasn't anchored properly. Somewhere out there is a nexus, a place where the creature is tied to this world. If we destroy it, we might sever its connection and banish it." Amaro nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "And what happens if we fail?" Elric's silence was answer enough. The next morning, Elric and Amaro headed to the nearest provincial archives, housed in a dilapidated building on the edge of the savannah. The clerks were skeptical of their request, but a hefty bribe loosened their tongues. After hours of searching, they found what they needed: an old missionary ledger detailing Father Vicente's activities. The last entry listed a remote plantation as the site of his final sermon. "The plantation's abandoned now," Amaro said, studying the map. "It's near the swamp, no one's been there in decades." "Perfect," Elric muttered. The journey to the plantation was long and treacherous. The road devolved into a series of narrow dirt paths, and the air grew humid and oppressive as they neared the swamp. The plantation itself was a sprawling ruin, its once grand house now little more than a skeleton of rotted wood and broken glass. Inside, they found the remnants of Vicente's last days, broken pews, a shattered altar, and walls covered in scrawled symbols. The air felt heavy, as though the space itself was suffocating under the weight of old sins. Elric examined the symbols, his breath catching as he recognized the same flawed circle from the journal. "This is it," he said. "This is where it all started." As he spoke, a low rumble shook the ground. Amaro backed away, his hand instinctively going to his machete. "What was that?" Elric didn't answer. His attention was fixed on the floor, where cracks had begun to spiderweb outward from the circle. A faint, malevolent glow seeped through the gaps. "The Nexus," Elric murmured. "We're standing on it." Before they could react, the ground collapsed beneath them, plunging Elric and Amaro into darkness. They landed in a cavern filled with stagnant water and the faint stench of decay. Elric's lantern sputtered to life, revealing walls slick with moss and inscribed with more of Vicente's sigils. "What is this place?" Amaro whispered. "A burial ground," Elric replied grimly. "Or a prison." As they waded through the murky water, a voice echoed through the cavern. It was deep and guttural, reverberating off the walls like the growl of a predator. "You should not have come." Elric spun, his revolver at the ready. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Show yourself," Elric demanded, his voice steady. The water rippled, and a figure began to rise from the depths. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs unnaturally elongated and its face obscured by a veil of shadow. The creature's presence was suffocating, its malice palpable. "You think you can end this?" it hissed, its voice dripping with contempt. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The Nuckelavee is free, and its hunger is eternal." Elric fired, but the bullets passed harmlessly through the figure, striking the cavern wall. The creature laughed, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "This is no ordinary demon," Elric muttered. "It's a harbinger." "What do we do?" Amaro asked, his voice trembling. "We find the heart of the Nexus," Elric replied, his determination hardening. "And we destroy it, no matter the cost." Deeper into the cavern, the water gave way to dry stone, and the air grew colder. The sigils on the walls became more intricate, their lines pulsing faintly as though alive. At the center of the chamber, they found a massive stone altar, its surface slick with dried blood. Above the altar hung a grotesque effigy, a twisted fusion of animal bones and human remains, bound together with sinew and hair. The air around it shimmered with heat, despite the chill of the cavern. "This is it," Elric said. "The anchor. This is what ties the Nuckelavee to this world." As he stepped forward, the air grew thick, and the cavern seemed to close in around them. A deafening roar filled the chamber, and the Nuckelavee appeared, its massive form blocking their escape. "You will not undo what has been done," the creature growled, its hollow eyes blazing. Elric ignored the beast, focusing instead on the altar. He pulled a vial of oil and a bundle of herbs from his bag, dousing the effigy in the mixture. "Hold it off," he ordered Amaro, lighting a match. Amaro hesitated, then charged the Nuckelavee with a war cry, his machete glinting in the faint light. The beast swatted him aside effortlessly, but it bought Elric enough time. He threw the match, and the effigy burst into flames. The cavern shook violently, and the Nuckelavee let out a blood-curdling scream, its body writhing as cracks began to form in its skeletal frame. The ritual was working, but the cost would be steep. The flames from the effigy climbed higher, casting wild shadows across the cavern. The Nuckelavee screamed again, its voice no longer commanding but desperate, as if it knew the tether anchoring it to this world was unraveling. Detective Elric Graves staggered back from the altar as the heat became unbearable. The sigils on the walls pulsed erratically, and the ground beneath him began to tremble. Amaro groaned from where he had been thrown, his machete lying shattered nearby. Elric, he croaked, his voice barely audible over the cacophony, it's not dying. It's fighting back. He was right. The creature's skeletal frame cracked and twisted, but it refused to collapse. Instead, its form grew distorted, expanding as if drawing power directly from the burning effigy. Elric's eyes widened as realization dawned. The Nexus, it's not just binding it here. It's feeding it. The flames consuming the effigy seemed to bend and warp, drawn into the Nuckelavee gaping maw. The creature's once gaunt frame began to bulk out, its sinews tightening and its claws elongating. This wasn't a banishment, it was an evolution. Amaro struggled to his feet, clutching his side. Then what do we do? Elric's mind raced. The sigils, the altar, the journal, it all pointed to a single, grim conclusion. The Nexus required not just fire but blood to sever its hold completely. Get out of here, Elric barked, his voice firm. Amaro froze. What are you talking about? I need to finish this, and you need to live. Go. Amaro hesitated, but the Nuckelavee bellow snapped him out of his trance. With a pained nod, he limped toward the cavern's entrance. Elric turned back to the altar, gripping his dagger tightly. Blood, his blood, would seal the rift and sever the creature's tie to this world. He stepped forward, ignoring the searing heat and the weight of the Nuckelavee gaze. You're not leaving here, Elric growled, raising the blade. The Nuckelavee lunged, its claws raking the air just inches from Elric's face. With a roar of defiance, Elric slashed his palm and slammed his bleeding hand onto the altar. The moment his blood touched the stone, the cavern erupted with light. The light was blinding, a searing white that illuminated every crack and crevice of the cavern. The Nuckelavee let out a howl that shook the very earth, its grotesque form contorting as if being torn apart by invisible chains. Elric gritted his teeth, forcing himself to remain upright as the altar beneath him grew cold and slick. The sigils on the walls flared brightly, their lines merging into a single, pulsating web of energy that converged on the effigy. Enough, Elric growled, pressing his bloodied hand harder against the stone. The energy from the sigils lashed out like bolts of lightning, striking the Nuckelavee. The creature reared back, its skeletal rider twisting and breaking, its horse-like body collapsing in on itself. The flames from the effigy roared one last time before extinguishing completely. And then, silence. Elric collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The cavern was still now, the oppressive weight of the Nuckelavee presence finally lifted. The altar beneath him was cold and lifeless, its once brilliant symbols now darkened and inert. Amaro returned cautiously, his face pale. Did it work? Elric nodded weakly. It's gone. For now. The journey back to the village was somber. Amaro supported Elric as they trudged through the swamp, their footsteps the only sound in the otherwise silent landscape. By the time they reached Luando, the sun was beginning to rise, casting the village in hues of gold and crimson. The villagers gathered around them, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and fear. It's over, Amaro announced. The Nuckelavee is gone. A cheer erupted, but Elric felt no triumph. The cost of victory weighed heavily on him, the blood, the pain, the lives lost. Baba Namuri approached, her milky eyes fixed on Elric. You've done well, detective, she said, her voice softer than before. But the scars of this will remain. Elric nodded, his expression grim. The creature may be gone, but the wound it left behind will take time to heal. Namuri's gaze lingered on him, as if she saw something others could not. You carry a heavy burden, Elric Graves. Be careful it does not break you. As the villagers began to rebuild, Elric retreated to his hut, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and exhaustion. The journal lay open on the table, its final pages blank. The Nexus was destroyed, but the darkness Vicente had unleashed felt far from over. And somewhere in the shadows of his mind, he could still hear the Nuckelavee parting words. I am eternal. You cannot kill hunger. You cannot kill death. Elric Graves rested for only a few hours before the nightmares began. In his dreams, the Nuckelavee stalked him through a landscape of ash and fire. The ground cracked beneath its hooves, and its skeletal rider reached out with claws that promised eternal torment. When Elric woke, drenched in sweat, the feeling of the creature's gaze lingered. He lit a lantern and returned to Father Vicente's journal, searching for something, anything, that might explain why the beast's presence haunted him still. Among the scribbled pages, he found a fragment of a note he'd overlooked before. The words were faint, as if Vicente himself had doubted their importance. The writer is but the herald. Behind it stands the true hunger. Elric frowned. The journal had led him to believe the Nuckelavee was the apex of the summoning, but this passage suggested otherwise. Was the Nuckelavee merely a precursor to something worse? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Chief Amaro entered, his face grim. "There's something you need to see," Amaro said. Amaro led Elric to the village square, where a small crowd had gathered, murmuring nervously. At the center of the commotion stood an animal carcass, a goat, its throat slit and its body arranged unnaturally. The pattern of its entrails mirrored the same flawed summoning circle Elric had seen in the mission and the cavern. Pinned to the carcass was a scrap of parchment, the ink smeared but legible. "You are too late. The gate opens soon." The words sent a chill down Elric's spine. The Nuckelavee was gone, but someone, perhaps the same person who had originally summoned it, was continuing Vicente's work. Who could have done this? Amaro asked, his voice trembling. "Someone in the village, or close enough to watch us," Elric said grimly. He scanned the faces of the gathered crowd, searching for a hint of guilt or fear. The summoner didn't stop after the Nuckelavee. This was just the beginning. The crowd grew restless, whispers of betrayal and mistrust rippling through them. Elric raised a hand, silencing them. "No one is leaving the village until I find the one responsible," he declared. "If the gate opens, none of us will survive." As night fell again, Elric worked tirelessly, piecing together what he'd learned. The effigy, the symbols, the notes in Vicente's journal, they all pointed to a larger ritual, one that required more than the Nuckelavee presence. "The gate," he murmured to himself. "The circle was a summoning. But the gate, that's something else entirely." He returned to Baba Namuri, hoping her knowledge of the old ways might shed light on the matter. She listened carefully as he explained what he'd found, her face growing more somber with each word. "The gate is a portal," she said at last. "A passage between worlds. If it opens, it will not be just the Nuckelavee. Worse things will come through. Things we cannot name." Elric nodded. "How do we stop it?" "You already know," she replied, her gaze piercing. "The one who called it must pay the price. Their life for the seal." Elric grimaced. He had suspected as much but hoped for another way. "Do you know who it is?" she asked. "Not yet," Elric admitted. "But I will." Elric spent the following day interrogating the villagers, his questions cutting through their denials and half-truths. The tension in the air was palpable, each person watching their neighbor with suspicion. It wasn't until late afternoon that a breakthrough came. One of the elders, a quiet man named Carlos, confessed under pressure that he had seen Mateus slipping away from the village the previous night. Elric found Mateus near the river, crouched over a crude altar. The younger man froze when he saw the detective approach, then bolted into the trees. "Stop!" Elric roared, giving chase. The pursuit was brutal, the uneven terrain threatening to trip them both at every turn. But Elric's years of experience gave him the edge, and he tackled Mateus to the ground near the riverbank. "Why?" Elric demanded, pinning him down. "Why summon the beast?" "I didn't mean to." Mateus cried. "I didn't know what I was doing. I only wanted power, to save my family, to stop the drought. But it got out of control." "You're lying," Elric growled. The Nuckelavee wasn't enough for you, was it? You're still trying to finish Vicente's work. Mateus's eyes widened in terror. I swear, it's not me anymore. Someone else, someone worse is leading it now. Elric hesitated, his grip tightening on Mateus's collar. Who? I don't know. Mateus gasped. But they're here. They've always been here. Elric dragged Mateus back to the village and locked him in a storeroom under Amaro's supervision. The young man's confession had complicated things. If he wasn't lying, and Elric believed he wasn't, then the true summoner was still at large. That night, Elric gathered the villagers in the church and laid out the truth. The Nuckelavee wasn't summoned by accident, he said. And it wasn't Mateus who started this. Someone else is here, someone who knows exactly what they're doing. If we don't stop them, the gate will open, and none of us will survive. A murmur of fear swept through the crowd, but one voice rose above the rest. Why should we believe you? It was Joachim, the elder who had first accused Mateus. How do we know you're not the one bringing this evil on us? Elric stepped forward, his eyes blazing. You don't have to believe me. But if you don't help me, you'll all die. As the villagers argued, Elric's thoughts drifted to the journal. Vicente's final entry had mentioned something cryptic: the herald paves the way, but the shadow walks behind. Elric realized he was missing something crucial. The Nuckelavee was only the beginning, a harbinger for something far worse. And it was already here. Detective Elric Graves spent the night pacing the dimly lit church, his mind racing. The villagers had dispersed to their homes, uneasy but unwilling to face the dark truths head-on. Only Chief Amaro remained, his machete resting across his lap as he sat near the altar. What now? Amaro asked, his voice low. We wait, Elric said, though the word tasted bitter. The real summoner is in this village. They'll act again soon. They have to, if they want to open the gate. Amaro frowned. And if they finish the ritual before we stop them? Elric's jaw tightened. Then we don't live to see morning. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the church's wooden shutters. Shadows danced across the walls, and for a moment, Elric thought he saw a figure standing in the doorway. But when he turned, there was nothing. The hours dragged on, each second stretching unbearably. Then, shortly after midnight, a sound pierced the silence, a low, mournful wail carried on the wind. Elric's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. It's coming from the storeroom, Amaro said, already on his feet. The two men sprinted through the darkened village, the sound growing louder as they approached the building where Mateus was being held. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of rot, and the temperature had dropped sharply. The door to Mateus's cell was ajar. Elric pushed it open cautiously, his weapon drawn. The room was empty. Mateus was gone. Damn it, Elric cursed, scanning the room for any sign of a struggle. The walls were smeared with dark, oily marks that looked like handprints, but they were too large to belong to Mateus. Amaro pointed to the ground, where a trail of bloody footprints led out of the building and into the night. They took him. Or he went willingly, Elric muttered. The trail wound through the village, heading toward the outskirts. Elric and Amaro followed it in silence, their breath visible in the unnaturally cold air. As they moved, the wailing sound grew louder, shifting in tone until it resembled a chorus of voices, some crying, others laughing. When they reached the edge of the swamp, the footprints stopped abruptly. Ahead of them, a faint light flickered through the trees. Elric motioned for Amaro to stay close. Whatever happens, don't let it separate us. The two men crept through the undergrowth, the flickering light growing brighter with each step. As they emerged into a clearing, they saw a sight that made their blood run cold. Mateus stood in the center of a circle of torches, his arms raised in supplication. Around him, cloaked figures chanted in a language Elric didn't recognize. The air shimmered with heat, despite the frigid temperature, and in the center of the circle, a dark rift was beginning to form, a tear in reality itself. "It's the gate," Elric whispered. Amaro tightened his grip on his machete. "What do we do?" Elric didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the figures, searching for any clue that might identify the summoner. Then, as the flames from the torches flared, he saw it, a figure standing apart from the others, their face obscured but their hands outstretched, directing the ritual. "That's them," Elric growled. Elric burst into the clearing, firing a warning shot into the air. The cloaked figures scattered, their chants turning to cries of panic. Matthias turned toward Elric, his face pale and streaked with tears. "Stop this now!" Elric bellowed. Matthias shook his head, his voice trembling. "I can't. They're making me do it. They'll kill me if I stop." Elric's eyes flicked to the summoner. The figure remained motionless, their hands still raised toward the rift. Without hesitation, Elric aimed his revolver and fired. The bullet struck the figure in the shoulder, sending them sprawling to the ground. The rift flickered, its edges rippling as the energy feeding it began to wane. But before Elric could approach, the Nuckelavee voice echoed through the clearing. "Fools! You cannot stop what is already begun." The ground beneath them shook violently, and the rift flared brighter, its edges expanding. From within, a clawed hand emerged, followed by another. The creature that emerged from the rift was unlike anything Elric had ever seen. It was massive, its body a grotesque amalgamation of sinew and shadow, its face featureless save for a gaping maw that dripped with black ichor. The air around it grew colder still, and the torches were snuffed out as though by an unseen force. Amaro stepped back, his face pale. "What is that?" "The true hunger," Elric said grimly. The creature let out a deafening roar, its voice reverberating in Elric's chest. It moved with terrifying speed, swiping at the remaining cloaked figures and reducing them to little more than smears of blood and ash. Elric fired his revolver, but the bullets had no effect. The creature turned toward him, its maw opening impossibly wide. "Run!" Elric shouted, shoving Amaro toward the trees. But there was nowhere to run. The creature's presence filled the clearing, its shadow stretching out like tendrils, wrapping around Elric and Amaro. For a moment, all was darkness. When Elric's vision cleared, he was back at the altar in the cavern. The creature loomed above him, its maw inches from his face. "You think you can stop me?" it hissed. "You are nothing." A whisper in the wind. Elric reached into his coat, pulling out the vial of oil and herbs he'd used before. With a shaking hand, he poured it onto the altar and struck a match. The flames roared to life, and the creature screamed, its form writhing as the light consumed it. But it wasn't enough. The nexus had been weakened, but the creature was still tethered to the mortal world. Elric knew what he had to do. With a final, defiant glare at the beast, he pressed his bloodied hand to the altar once more. The flames surged, and the creature let out a final, deafening roar before collapsing into ash. As the light faded, Elric slumped to the ground, his strength gone. The gate was closed. The village was safe. But at what cost? In the distance, as darkness reclaimed the land, a faint voice whispered. "Hunger always returns."